Hello everyone, welcome to this demo showing you Tricentis Tosca data integrity and how it's being used in the healthcare industry. Tosca data integrity is an end-to-end data warehouse testing tool. We set up tests along your warehouse from when you first have access to the data to when you do different moves and transformations. As you can see on the right-hand side, we set up what we call pre-screening and vital checks, doing tests like metadata, formatting, completeness, and so on, at different stages as early as possible so we can identify issues when they occur. Once we do these types of tests, we can then focus on the data itself and do reconciliation, transformation, and profiling or monitoring. We can also test on the reporting layer for BI. Whatever your data source is, whether it's a file or a database, and wherever it's hosted, we have connectors that will allow us to connect to your different data warehouses, wherever they may be, and set up these different types of tests. For today, we're going to focus on a Medicare example. If we look at the CMS star ratings, these can impact facilities' financial value. Moving from 3 to 4 stars can increase your revenue by 13 to 17%, just looking at new enrollments and bonuses. This can also affect you negatively with different penalties. There are also a number of other ways we use the star rating, where it comes to competitiveness or measuring things like standards within the facilities. Ratings can also impact the way you're perceived locally and nationally, and they can help consumers decide where to get healthcare. These are just some examples. These star ratings are assigned based on data, so it's very important that this data is accurate. Medicare makes this data available publicly, so for today's example, we have downloaded all the Medicare datasets, which are a number of flat files in CSV format. And throughout the warehouse, we've set up an environment and done certain checks. We can do metadata and formatting checks on the flat files, and as it gets moved and transformed throughout the warehouse, we can do other types of testing. For today, I've set up a sample environment using these CSV files, uploading it to Snowflake, to SQL Server, and creating some Power BI reports, so we can get a good idea of this scenario and how it works in healthcare. So now I'm going to open up my environment and we can see how this testing can be done. Before we jump in and look at the actual tests that we can create, let's first have a look at my environment and my data. We start off with the Medicare data provided in flat files in CSV format. These have been uploaded into SQL Server, into my Medicare table, and into my Snowflake instance over here. I've also created some Power BI reports based on this data. Along the way, the data has been transformed. And now we can go through and set up our tests. So as soon as we have access to the data, we want to set up what we call pre-screening and vital checks. And as the data starts moving, we can also do similar types of tests along the way. And the idea is to have this layered approach so that as soon as an issue is encountered, we identify it and we can pinpoint it right away. We can later then focus on our more important reconciliation and transformation tests, and these tests become more simplified as we don't have to take into account a lot of these types of tests. We can obviously then do some report testing using APIs where available, or the UI like I'm going to show us today. So if I fire up Tosca over here, you can see here's the UI, and on the left hand side we have our navigation panel. Before we look at our data warehouse testing, let's first look at our model-based approach that we have, and we do this across all technologies. We cover about 160 different technologies out of the box. This is growing all the time, but you can see some examples of what we call models. This is what we have. This is what we call model-based automation. If I expand this, you can see there's a model that represents a web application and all the different controls we can interact with and pull data from, and the same as other technologies along the way. For data warehouse testing, we don't need to create these models. There's a number of models that are provided out of the box. If I click on one of these, you can see there's an example of a model that'll pull data from a source and compare it to a target. And we can connect to the data sources in different ways, whether it's local, whether it's up on the cloud somewhere. We have different connectors. Once we do that connection, we can set up the different types of tests. So to start off with, let's quickly create a model so you can understand what that's like. And I'm going to scan my desktop, and you can see I can scan all the applications open on my desktop. I could also scan APIs, mobile, PDFs, whatever it might be. But the main thing is we're creating a reusable model, which becomes my single point of maintenance going forward. What I've done for today is I've got a web-based application. Very basic, but just to give you an idea, let's say this was a BI report, and I will show you a more complex one later, but just so you can see the process of creating a model is basically scanning it, whether it's a UI or an API. We scan the endpoint if it's an API, the application's interface if it's a UI, and it allows you to simply go to the actual interface and click on it and select where you want to pull data from, if it's a table or a chart or whatever it might be, or interact with the actual fields. This could be navigation to get you to the actual chart, wherever it might be. We would simply select all the controls off the application, and on the right hand side, Tosca will build this reusable model for me. I hit the finish button, my model is saved, and if there's any changes later, I can do a rescan, synchronize it, and update it based on new builds or releases that come out. I can do the same for API or any other technology, but for today I will stick with my UI application. If you have a look here, you can see there's my model for my UI application, which we've just created, and the controls I selected. And in order to use that, we would create a test case. So if I come over here to my sandbox in my test case section, I can drag and drop the model, it creates a new test case, and I can expand this. And now I can enter my data in the value section here. I will just enter test, for example, as an input. And if I wanted to save data from a table, I can go to a specific column, for example, silver. If I jump back to my report, there's a row called price per year, so I can make this dynamic, and if the data moves around the table, it'll go and find it for me wherever it is. You could do verifications or assertions, but I'm going to do a buffer, which means save the data to a variable name, such as price per year. I can run this, and this is a fully automated test pulling data from a web-based application, entering test up here, and then saving the value here to a variable name, which I could then use to compare in a database query or an API or somewhere else. This is what we call model-based automation. Very simple example, but we do this across all applications and technologies. You can combine them. For example, here I have two models that do REST automation. I can drag and drop them into my API, into my UI test case. And like you saw before, we have my data warehouse testing. I can drag and drop a data warehouse testing model into the same test. And here you'll see now we have a test that goes across a UI, APIs, and a data warehouse, verifying from source to target. You could enter all the data here hard-coded into the test, or you could convert it into a template and parameterize it. And this is what we mainly use for Tosca DI. If I come over here, you'll see some examples of what we call pre-screening and vital checks. And let me collapse my module section there to give us more space. And you'll see a number of different types of predefined templates. So here's my test, but if I click on one of these, you'll see, for example, we have a template that's doing a metadata test in the Oracle syntax. If I expand this, you could see there's a predefined SQL query pulling data from a source and then comparing it against target. These are just some examples. We have quite a large number of these different templates. If you come down here, you can see we're doing field level tests, database to database, checking for null counts, for example, from a source to a target. Again, predefined template, buffering or saving the value of a source count that we do, and comparing it directly against the target. You can copy these, you can paste it and create your own new ones, and update the queries to meet your requirements. For example, I can say where and date equals, and use a dynamic expression to grab today's date. And this will be my custom query. These templates will be leveraged in a wizard, which I'll fire up in a second, which can be used to create tests by the thousands. These are tests that are very simple and very quick to create, are very hard to maintain on a large scale. Our wizard helps you create and maintain these and really get a lot of value in doing these early tests. If I collapse all of these, you can also see we have test sheets, and these are used for data-driven testing. The great thing is Tosca will do this automatically based on these wizards and the source and the targets that you point the actual wizard to. So let's start off and see some. I'm going to use my sandbox here, and this is the data integrity part of the tool. If I come over here, you can see here's where I can launch a wizard to do pre-screening checks on a file, file to database, on table level, database to database, and on field level as well. If I collapse all of this, let's go back to my desktop. I've got an example here of a customer environment, and let's say your landscape has different moves or hops or transformations along the way. We can build up a structure like this that meets your end-to-end environment. I'm just going to copy that. This will save me time, and create the same structure here in Tosca DI. And now I can basically say from when ingestion, when I get the actual data, I want to do some checks. Then as I start moving it, I want to do some field level tests, and then I want to do some reconciliation based on some transformations that happen. And then I can do some profiling and reporting. So let's start off by doing a very simple one based on a file, and this will be one of the flat files, the CSVs that were provided by Medicare. I'm going to navigate to these flat files. There's a hospital flat file there. If I open this up, it'll give me a preview of the file. I can push the first row to header. I can put a delimiter as a comma separated, and I get a nice preview of my data there. I can hit the next, and now I can select the actual types of tests I want to do. So there's a template already built, like the one I showed you for database to database field level. There's predefined templates for file level tests as well. So let's say I wanted to run some tests and make sure that there's no empty values in the facility ID. I can just tick that box. I can tick the box to say make sure it's numeric. I can say make sure that this minimum value is, for example, 100, and the maximum value in these columns in the file itself does not exceed 100,000 or 11,000. I can do sums, do value ranges, whatever it might be. So for example, if I come down to state, maybe we want to do a value range check. If I come over here, I've got this set up already. I can copy the value range of all the states in America, come over here and simply paste that value range here. And now I'm going to do a value range check for states. So you have control over these templates. There's a lot of standard ones that we've set up based on our experience and existing customers that we find are commonly used. But as you can see, you can create as many as you want. And I'm just going to select some random ones along the way. Let's say you wanted to do a check for unique ID, for measure ID. You can do different row counts along the way. Let's make up a value here. All of these can be set up, and these tests will be created for you. This is just one example. There's a template for pre-screening tests. You can automatically create an execution list so that they can be hooked up to a build tool or a scheduler. And I can automatically create a requirement set, which will allow me to do risk-based testing. So you can prioritize your requirements and then hook up your tests to these requirements so you can have a more meaningful report based on business risk. Tosca DI will now grab the modules it needs, grab the templates you've customized based on your needs, and create these tests for me for this particular pre-screening for file level tests. And it's doing all of this automatically. And we'll see in a second when it finishes now. It's created 10 tests. One's going to load the file up into our caching database. And then we can run the actual tests itself. That's my execution list that we can hook up to our build tools. This is my risk-based testing I can do. As the tests run and pass and fail, it gives us a more meaningful report based on the business risk being covered. And then if we jump over here, we can see the actual tests. There's the template it pulled. And if we select one of them, let's go down to our value range test and expand that one. You can see there's my value range test checking these values for the state. Very simple example, but very helpful when you're doing these on a large scale. This works for creation and maintenance. The other thing it will do is we'll create a data sheet, which will look at some more complex ones. That's all data-driven testing. So you can come in here, update the data as well, and simply tell Tosca to update all the tests linked to it. So let's do one more, and then we'll move on to the data itself. So if I come over here, let's fire up the field level test, database to database. And as I mentioned, I uploaded my data to SQL Server, so I can connect to that instance. And there's my hospital tables. I can hit the next button and connect to Snowflake, where the same data has been uploaded. You can see I can also connect to data sources using extracted DDLs. So this is using my ODBC connection, and different connections you can set up to make your life easier later. Or you can use the ones straight from the ODBC connection, set them up on the fly, or extracted DDLs. But it parses the schema, pulls all the information it needs, and this is the data that will be injected into the SQL templates that we've saw defined earlier. I can set up different filters as well. For example, I'm looking for Medicare. Only bring me back the tables with Medicare, and there's 2. Hit the next button, and it'll try to do an auto match to match the tables. Otherwise, you can manually map them. So if I dragged and dropped and said, I'm looking for hospital, and state, and you can see there's a mismatch there. So the names of the fields have also not been identified. So you can double click in there and manually map them yourself, whatever it couldn't match. I've done that already, and once you've done that, you can actually export it and create a mapping file, which will be very useful for later, so you don't have to do that again. So I've already got my mapping file here. I'm going to overwrite my current mapping, and it'll automatically map them for me. I can hit next, and here's the 2 tables, and you can see there's my different fields, and now based on the templates you saw, you can actually tick the boxes and say these are the types of tests I want to do for this one, just like we did with the file, and go through it. So I'm not going to do that for all of them, but just so you can see, I copied and pasted a template before, called it Demo SQL. There's it now available in my wizard. To make it look a bit more impressive, I'm just going to select all of them, although it doesn't make sense, but just so you can see how the wizard works, hit the next button, and now do the same as before. Automatically create execution lists, automatically create business requirements for risk-based testing, and hit the finish button. So now you'll see, like before, it will pull all the data that it needs from the modules and from the templates and create my tests. And there's a few more. I mentioned before, we can create these tests by the thousands when it gets to table level tests. These are field level tests, so it's a bit less, but you can see the value on doing these on a large scale. If I open this up, what you'll see is as the volume goes higher, we actually have parallel execution, and this will help reduce the runtime in the long run. So you can run parallel instances. For example, on my machine, I can run 5 instances in one go, so it'll run 5 SQL queries at once to help reduce the runtime. Okay. So let's grab the query that we actually amended. There's a test that's using that demo SQL template that I amended. I can jump to that test, expand it, and you can see exactly what's happening on there. There's my amended query, and you can see it pulled all the data it needed from the source and the target and injected it into the template and created physical tests. So my single point of maintenance is the templates. We also have the data sheets like before, and Tosca will then update them based on any changes we made, and we can do them directly here. You can see it parsed the schema, pulled that schema out, pulled the table, the column names, did the mapping and the matching, and those are the types of tests it's running. And it's just basically data-driven testing. We can use Excel spreadsheets for these as well. So now that we've done those sort of pre-screening and vital checks that we call them, field level tests, we can then move on to the data itself. So we can set up different tests, and we have different pre-built modules like we saw earlier, but for now I'm going to go to my existing test that I had set up. So if I come over here to my healthcare, these are the ones we're looking at today for our example. So we've seen these already. I'm going to jump to my reconciliation, double click on this folder just to bring it in view, and you can see different tests. So let me collapse this so you can see the tests that we've set up. And I've set up 4 different examples for us today. One's going to just check moving data from a file to a Snowflake database. And if I double click on that, and you can see, for example, here I've set up using a file. I've pointed to the CSV file, We're first connecting to a source. We can connect to any data source wherever it might be, as I mentioned. In this case, it's just a simple CSV locally stored. The first row is the header, and then we can do some trimming depending on the formatting. So as I move this file across my warehouse, it might have transformed or changed according to the uploads. So I can actually trim out the double quotes if I want them to match the actual from source to target. I can trim out any formattings when it comes to figures, as you can see. And there's a number of these trimmings available. As you can see, if I highlight over here, there's an example of all the different trimming functions available. So if I scroll down a little more, you can see I've hooked up to a database where it says Snowflake. There's my query I'm running. I'm just selecting all the data in this instance, doing my column formatting and trimming as well. And then at the end over here, you can see we have some reporting we can set up. So there's a lot of reporting in the execution list that it creates in the log files, and we can run reports on that. But as we get to large volumes of data, it becomes very difficult to read. So we actually generate an HTML report, and you can customize different settings on this report, as you can see. And this will be a lot easier to read, which I'll show you in a second. You can also do things like for certain columns, you might want to point to the footnote, and there's allow a tolerance of ±2, for example. All of these are possible, and they're all out of the box, which avoids you having to run SQL queries. The next one we can have a look at is just a straightforward compare from two tables up in Snowflake. So I'm pointing to one table for state, comparing it against the hospital, similar settings as along the way. But when I get to the bottom here, you'll see I've also said create me a log file with all the match data in CSV format, which can be used for other functionalities later. One of the things we noticed and why we like this example is when we uploaded the data, we noticed that some of the data here was a mismatch. So if we look at Alaska, the mortality rate in some of these hospitals, and we added these four values together, it came to 23. We then looked at it by state using the same criteria, and we counted the same values, and it came to 24. So how would we test that up, or how would we set that up in Tosca DI? If I come over here, you can see we first start off by pointing to the first table and doing a count, and saved it to a variable buffer name by state. I then scroll down, I did the same query against target, but this time I counted all four cells, four different buffer names. I can use an out-of-the-box model to add them up using a math function, and then compare the two total values together down here. Again, all out of the box, so it avoids us writing complex queries. The other example we had, if I jump over here, is loading up more complex files like JSON or XMLs. It's more semi-structured data. If you have a look at it here, all of this is in JSON format. This is publicly available data again. If I scroll down here, you can see all the data in the JSON format. What Tosca DI will do is we have a pre-built model that will load up all the data, and it'll load it to a caching database, and it'll normalize it and flatten it for us to different tables. We can then say, now I can use my reconciliation model once it's been loaded up, but now I'll point to my caching database instead of the file, connect the different tables that it created, and then compare it to another data source over here. If we have a look at that before we move on, let's jump to our execution list and see all our executions that have ran for my different areas. So although we create these tests in different layers, we can assemble them in execution lists to run in a logical sequence. And if I come over here, here's my reconciliation reports. There's my test, and you can see all the different log files. If I open up one of these, you can see there's a row by row comparison, source to target, all the options in there. And here's my log with some differences. So that, as you can imagine, would be tricky to read within there. So this is where we create those HTML reports. So if I come over here, here's my HTML report. I can launch it, and it'll tell me this data was compared. It was 12,000 records. Found some errors, and it maxed out at 200, and that's what I defined. And I can go through and look at the source file to target Snowflake. Here's all my differences. I can change the display to all or 20 to show me the first 20. Scroll down, look at all the data, and then scroll across and see the actual mismatches that occurred. So this makes it a lot easier to identify, and it's saved outside of the tool. I just put the date and timestamp. That can go to a shared drive somewhere for everyone to access. It can show you the differences, where data only appears in the source and not in the target, only in the target, and invalid as well from source to target. And you, of course, get the summary view over here of all the columns where that had the actual errors. If we jump back to Tosca DI, we'll see over here, we can then move further down and look at some examples of reporting and profiling. So if we start off with profiling, so if we start off with reporting, I'll click on my test here. You can see as I created a model earlier, we can automate Power BI reports just by simply launching the browser using an out-of-the-box model, automating the screens to navigate to get me to my reports using all the filters, and then saving the data straight from the actual screen. Let's run that quick so you can have a look and see some UI automation. And what you'll see now is we're actually going to launch my Power BI report in my Chrome browser, navigate to the actual report, and pull the data from it. That data can then be compared to another mart or anywhere along the warehouse, and that's what I've set up. So we've saved the data from the actual Power BI report. Two variable names called measure ID, footnote, and facility. Then we run a query against a mart, and then we can compare the values together. If that data is accessible by an API, we would always go for the API first, as this is a lot more stable, easier to create and maintain going forward. But as you can see, we can pull the data straight from the UI as well. The last example I wanted to show today is on profiling, and this is where you can see we want to count the number of hospitals with low survey ratings per facility. So again, if I have a look at my data here, I ran some queries, and based on the data we decided let's do some profiling where facilities that have star ratings of 1 and 2 and the number comes back to a certain criteria, let's set up some profiling tests for that. So that was my SQL query that I started off with, but I already brought it into Tosca DI. I parameterized it, and I basically said there's a threshold. If they have low ratings above this threshold, I want to take some actions or get notified about that. So here's my query I set up, and then here's my if condition that I added to the end. And then every time a facility is above the threshold, we write it out to an XML spreadsheet, and then we can actually email that off to another user. So we have predefined models that will connect to mail servers and send emails for us. So you can upload that spreadsheet to users and notify them, or you could do it via Slack or any other channel that you decide. But what I've also done is I've created my own spreadsheet and said these are the different facilities I want, these are the different ranges, and those are my thresholds. So it's all data-driven testing. You can set them up yourself, but as you saw before, if you do the pre-screening and vital checks and field level tests, we have wizards to create and maintain them. So you have full control of these templates of the SQL queries, but by breaking it up into smaller pieces and having these templates, this data-driven approach really addresses maintenance later, and it allows a lot of non-technical people to also create these tests and execute them. The last thing we want to look at, which kind of ties everything together, is our risk-based testing. We saw how we can run and report on pure numbers, hooking up execution lists to build tools or schedulers. But our risk-based testing is also very important, as this allows us to tie all our tests back to requirements, prioritize them, and give us a real view of what state my testing is in. So here, for example, if I look at my profiling, it says basically 81% of the business risk has been covered by these tests that ran and were linked to this requirement. So thanks for watching. I hope that was useful to you.